novel, and in 2021, her acclaimed non-fiction book, Lies, Damn Lies, was published by Ultimo Press. Enclave is her third novel. And in conversation with Claire tonight is Rhianna Patrick. Rhianna is a Torres Strait Islander freelance journalist, broadcaster, and audio content creator. She has almost 25 years' experience in the media, having worked across news, TV documentaries, and national radio programming. You can currently hear her as part of the daily news podcast, The Briefing from Listener. Big round of applause for our speakers tonight.
Thank you so much, and just acknowledging that as a Torres Strait Islander, I have no bloodline connection to where we meet, and also paying my respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which I find myself, to their people, past and present, and anyone who may be in this room as well. Claire, do you want to give acknowledgement before we start?
Yeah, sure. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. This is almost about as far you can get from my country and still be on land. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and their elders past and present, and the young ones learning culture to become the elders of the future.
Whenever I read a Claire G. Coleman novel, I always know to expect the unexpected. And Enclave definitely is another book where that is the way that you should come at it. But I also walk away from those stories still thinking about the themes, about the story, about what's happened long after I finished that last page. And that's exactly what happened with Enclave as well. Claire, would you like to read something from the book to start us off before we get into this chat?
Sure. I'm going to be really slack and just read the start. Because this is because my Melbourne launch was cancelled. This is my first time talking about this novel. Yeah, because I mean I've been on publicity non-stop, and that's other old book. The sun is casting its first light over the town, sneaking up, about to peek over the horizon, like a child stealing a look at a grown-up's party. Inside the monotonously grey walls, rectangular chalk-white buses are gathered waiting. Some are lined up neurotically neat, others more scattered. Some appear like gossiping groups, but all are plain, unadorned, identical. Nothing on them to identify their owners or speak of their purpose. Outside the gates, black buses are nosed almost perfectly parallel to parking spots. There's nothing to differentiate the buses outside from those inside but the colour and the inside bus lack of order. People in black unload themselves from the black vehicles outside, mill about the hard sand before the looming, intimidating gates. Outside, there's people who filter into long, fence-divided queues, each holding up a card the size and shape of a credit card. Each approach someone in uniform, from a row of 12, who holds a machine to those cards. Those whose cards make the machine beep, which appears to be everybody who wave through a narrow gate. Guards in jumpsuits, bulking in some places that implied armour, in other places that suggested weapons, watch the proceedings, hands on batons on their belts. Inside, those people pass through gates, each sorting to a bus, each seeming to know already which ones they're heading to, though how they did was anyone's guess. There was no confusion, nobody getting lost, no need for the armed guards to approach any of them. There seems to be no rush. It is the gate that is bottlenecked. Once through, the early comers feel no urgency. Outside, the now empty buses drive away as the last person has their ID card bipped and slips through the gates. Last few through the gates know they are last, and no one to delay their bus rush to their vehicles. The men with ID machines walk through after them, the armed security following. The gates close, a hidden beeper beeps, followed by the clunk of an electronic lock engaging. A lower wall circles the bus park, barely taller than the buses themselves. Wide gates open and let the full buses through. Silence descends. The guards stop long enough to scan the car park once, although through their visors it's possible to know what they're looking at or looking for, or even if they have faces. Then they turn and walk through smaller doors in another compound. The sun dragged the last piece of itself past the horizon. A lone figure in black steps out from the shadows of the bus park wall, following the security guard to the door before disappearing again into shadow.
Thanks, Claire. Now, the start of the story is set in a walled city where there are drones, surveillance cameras are a commonplace, where brown people are servants, and where nothing seems like nothing what it seems like at all. And Christine, the character in this book, starts to slowly realise that Safetown is anything but the name, and what she thought was the truth is anything but as well. And it made me wonder where this story started for you, where these ideas came from of having those deeper conversations about surveillance drones in this place where nothing seems to be secret.
Well, when I started writing it, the release was delayed, so I started writing it probably 4 years ago, I would say. I think I did that normal thing I do where I start writing a book while I'm touring the last one, which is stupid behaviour. But actually, I think I started while I was editing the one before, which is even stupider. But I was watching the news, and politicians were talking about this idea of isolating people away from the undesirables, like saying, "Oh, if you don't want to be near undesirable people, you don't have to be." And this whole idea of undesirable became a really big thing about 4 years ago. Most of them are talking about refugees, but also treating Aboriginal people as undesirables, and the whole Dondale thing was happening about then, and the indefinite detention was blowing up. Everyone was finally paying attention to this thing that some of us had noticed for a long time. So there's this whole energy where people are becoming increasingly isolated from our shared humanity, and that struck me. And I thought, well, what would happen to a society that completely loses track of the fact that humans are essentially all deep down human? There's somebody said to me years ago that people often talk about something being outside of human nature. And then they said, but in reality, anything a human does is human nature, because a human did it. The only thing outside of human nature are things that no one has ever done. So thinking about all that, I thought, well, what happens if you extrapolate this siloization on the internet and in communities and extrapolate to an entire city of people who are using money and power to not have to spend any time with anyone not like them?
So what is the world that we find ourselves in, and the place now that Safety Town exists in? What has happened to the world?
Well, the world's in the middle of the global warming apocalypse, and I think we are now. I mean, I think we can state with utter certainty now that we are in the middle of the global warming caused collapse. And anyone who thinks we're not is fooling themselves. So it's a world in the middle of global warming collapse like we are, but it's a world where some people have chosen to do what they can to mitigate global warming, and some people have decided that what they want to do is protect themselves, which is kind of the dichotomy we already have in our society. That I'm always aware, and it was kind of in my mind when I was writing this novel as well, the difference between, for example, prepper culture and environmentalist culture. Environmentalists and preppers are both aware that that our lifestyles are coming to an end, that the lifestyle we've always lived on is collapsing. It's something that we all know. There's no question or debate possible there. We know that our lifestyle is ending, but environmentalists think how many people can we save, whereas preppers think for how long can I survive on my own. And that's kind of that was in my head as well. So Safetown is kind of like the people whose focus is saving themselves, not saving the world. And that's kind of what we're, the people who just think, well, I don't like the world where I'm in, so I'm going to hide from it. It's kind of like, think about, it's a giant prepper bunker in a way. A prepper bunker the size of a city.
It's not underground.
So it's not underground. But see, the thing is about the preppers who are preparing for the environmental apocalypse, they're not always hiding underground.
No.
They build fenced and walled compounds. And it's just like a big version of that.
Yeah, and I mean, And the way that you describe it in Enclave is that it's this quite sterile place in a way. There's sort of a conformity to it. There is differences between places, between the houses, and that's what Christine starts to realise, but that they all do look the same. And so I wonder about, you know, when we get into Safety Town, you know, can you describe exactly what Christine is living in and what it is to live in Safety Town?
Well, there's a really good metaphor that you'd all be aware of. I don't know if anyone's seen those housing estates or strip mall, you know, shopping centres along a road, where it looks like it's a bunch of separate buildings, but then you look close and you realise they're all connected together. They're all identical. And what they've done is they've made a whole bunch of identical stuff and done things to make it look different. Like you go to neighbourhoods now, and some of them are, every house is the same, but they painted the window frames different. That's kind of what Safety Town's like. It's like this place where everyone's house is the same, but some of them are mirror images of the others. Some of them are the same, but painted different. And we live in that world now, because I've been to housing estates where you look at that street and go, they're all the same. We don't even do that thing in some fishing towns in the southwest of England. They paint every house a different colour so that people can find their house in the middle of the night. We don't even do that. we're not even that smart. All exactly the same.
Well, it's kind of a place, really, isn't it, where everyone is keeping up with the Joneses, but they're all the Joneses.
Yeah, that's right. It's like they're all trying to show their overt displays of wealth, but all doing the same thing. So it's like imagine if we're all going out to show how wealthy we are. We all have about the same income and the same resources. So we're all showing our wealth in exactly the same way, doing exactly the same thing. It's kind of that place. It's a place that I was trying to write a place that the people who I don't like would love, but that would make me feel sick.
Very early on in the book, we meet Safety Net, and Christine talks us through sort of the place that Safety Net has in Enclave. What is the place of Safety Net? What is Safety Net?
Safety Net is, if you can imagine, Facebook is the only internet, but that the corporation who owns your house also owns Facebook, if you can imagine it that way. So you're being surveilled for your social media. Your only communication with the world at all is your social media. In a way, actually, funnily enough, after I started writing Enclave, in fact, I think it was after I finished editing. What's his name? I forgot his name. I don't care. Zuckerberg announced the foundation of Meta. And Meta looks like Safety Net, and that Meta is this idea that everyone in the world is connected to this same thing, like that's a lot like Facebook. You do everything on his network. You know, you buy your groceries on it, you visit your friends on it, you go to shopping on it, you go to a cafe on this thing, and it's woven through your entire existence. And that's kind of what social media has always planned that. Facebook's always planned that. You can tell they've always planned that because they kind of make it really cheap for businesses to create a website, but then that website is beholden to Facebook, and that's kind of the world of Safety Net. It's like Facebook, but everyone's on it, and they are watching. Which Facebook is watching you? I hate to say it, but they are.
So it seeps into every part of your life. And I think Christine mentions in the book, it's where she gets her email through, it's where the algorithm is talking to her and telling her what she might like, what she might want to buy.
It's kind of a haircut.
I think there's a part in the book where the family, which refers very much to her mother and father as mother and father, and they go out for lunch, and her father basically says to her, oh, you can just let Safety Net know your favourite meal and it can deliver that to wherever restaurant you are.
Yeah. Doesn't matter which restaurant it is, as long as it's on. So as long as Safety Net knows what you like, you'll get that anywhere. The thing is, we're not far from that now.
No, well, you think about when someone says, do you have that certain grocery card that you get points on, and it knows everything that you've just bought.
Yeah, and when you and now if you go on Google, guaranteed if you hit Google Shopping with a very poor search, you'll come up with something you searched before. If you're not very careful about what you're searching for. And there's a certain paranoia when people say that they talk about things in the presence of their phone, and those things get advertised to them soon. We can't prove that anyone's doing that, nor can we prove they're not doing it. We can't prove that if we're talking about bananas now, then you won't get an advert for bananas tomorrow. We can't prove that because Facebook has, for example, people don't know this, but I did a lot of research on social media abuses when I was writing the book. And Facebook owns a patent for a piece of software that can detect whose photo was taken on by the specks of dust on the lens. And if I took a photo of you and put it and sent it to you and you put it on the internet, Facebook would then know that we're associated. That knows whose phone took the photo. They own that patent. That's public information. They own that patent. They claim they haven't implemented it. I don't believe them.
Like how you're just getting everyone scared now. It's great, my book. But it's one of the things that I was thinking about while reading this, about where you talk about the algorithm of safety net, and the things that we might not necessarily know are happening that Christine is talking about, about safety net going, oh, maybe you would like to wear this, perhaps you would like this. And I wonder, you've just mentioned a little bit about what you were thinking about, but when it comes to that algorithm, is that something you've been giving thought to?
Well, strangely, and this is not really a revelation, but I don't know if anyone in this audience has heard it. But I have an honours degree in machine learning and mathematics and machine learning. When I did that honours degree in 2006, what Facebook are doing in kind of weaponizing your data against you to make you buy things was already possible. And I could have written those algorithms. So the algorithms exist. The algorithms in safety net that it goes, oh, you might like a haircut, look like your friends. That exists. I'm sorry, it already exists. They're just not doing it. And it's kind of when I was trying to work out what technology can do, I just drew from my university education in knowing what I would have been able to do in 2006, which is, if you think about it, it's terrifying. My honours degree was in running somebody's running software, like thousands of projects, software projects through a computer, and trying to work out how long a project should take based on how long other projects have taken. From that I worked out it should be possible to work out which employees are being lazy. And that's when I started studying artificial intelligence.
Well, if we look at the main protagonist in this book, Christine is 21. She's just finished her maths degree. She's not really sure what to do next, but what is happening in her life when we first meet her?
Well, she's a bit kind of listless and pathetic. It's anyone who's been to uni knows that feeling of finishing uni and go, what the fuck am I going to do now? We've all felt that. We've all felt that. Just kind of going through that moment of like, I finished uni and it's like, oh God, I don't know, do I want a job? Do I want to do more uni? Do I want to get drunk? Definitely want to get drunk. And that's kind of what she's going through. But importantly to the plot, of course, is that not only that, but her very best friend is also missing, which is important for the character because in a way her friendship with this person defines her, and it's taken away. So she's someone who's the relationship that defines her, she thinks defines her as a person, has been taken, is gone, and her university's ended, and she's and all she's surrounded by pretty much is her mum's friends, who are the most vile ladies whose lunch you can ever imagine.
But also a way that you bring in that conversation too with the mother around the expectation of how women in safety town are expected to look and expected to upkeep in a way.
And upkeep, like we think of upkeep as, put some lippy on, have a shower, that's a good start. Put lippy on, brush your hair, wear makeup, dress nice. Whereas in Safe Town, they've taken, of course, to the ultimate extreme, and looking after yourself is like 6 monthly checkups for this plastic surgeon, which we're not far from that now. If you look at, for example, there's a Louis Theroux documentary where he goes visit people who are going to plastic surgery every few months to get something else done, and they do things like they'll get their cheekbones raised, and then they'll decide that that makes their lips look too small and get the lips done. And they decide that their eyebrows are too low because they've had the lips and their cheekbones done, so they'll get the eyebrows done. This goes on and on and on. And that's kind of, this is kind of arms race in plastic surgery in Safetown, which in that sort of society is not impossible. I mean, the world lost Ivana Trump in recently, like today or yesterday, and who was who I will always remember as having appeared on the movie First Wives Club, with her and delivering her famous line, "Don't get mad, get everything." But she was the kind of, she is in a way the archetype of that type of character, the wealthy woman who feels this intense need to constantly upgrade herself with plastic surgery.
I had also wondered whether it's a sneaky comment that you tend to do in your books as well on the Western concept of beauty, and really playing with that a bit once we start to really see, I guess, beneath the veneer of this town.
Well, there's a thing that I always talk about with Lily, my partner, who's in the front row. Now she's going to be embarrassed. We always talk about this thing, which is there's in Australia anyway, there's Indigenous ways of looking at beauty, and there's white way of looking at beauty. And white way of looking at beauty is often makeup, white clothes, and plastic surgery, dyeing your hair. Whereas Indigenous way of beauty is kind of connection to culture and connection to family. It makes someone beautiful. You won't, for example, see an Aboriginal fine artist millionaire from Alice Springs going to get plastic surgery. Wouldn't happen. And so this is Western idea of that beauty that's very homogenizing. And Western culture has this way of looking at people, and the modern Western idea of beauty is this, if everyone went with the Western idea of beauty, we're all the same. And I don't know if anyone else has noticed, but we have, that every decade there's a current fashionable plastic surgery look. And then every actress looks like that. And then the next decade comes along and they all have plastic surgery again, and they look like that fashionable look. And there's this, it's a really weird thing. But First Nation people wouldn't really do that as a rule, because it's like, why would you want to be like everybody else when you could look like your grandmother? You know, there's this, it's a really weird, we live in this really weird culture where the idea of beauty is homogenizing. And there was a comic book in I think it was late 80s, in 2000 AD comics. I've got a lot of weird cultural references, where there was some people where everyone had some plastic surgery looked the same, that there was actually a plastic surgeon who capitalized on an interest in making people look ugly so they could be different than everyone else.
I can't even understand that logic, but sure. We start to see that Christine starts to notice little things and starts to question what's happening. What is the thing that really gets her thinking about what she's being told, what she's being taught, and maybe that perhaps it's not the truth she had always thought it was?
Well, I mean, that's the big thing. In this novel, I've gone a bit unusual for me in that at the core of the novel is a romance, which is not like me at all. But I want to see if I put a romance in the middle of a novel, what would happen, because I've never done it before. Why do what you've always done? So the thing that changed her life is she starts noticing that the female servants are far more beautiful than the women from Safetown. And the female servants are all people of colour. And they're all from outside, they're all outsiders, they're not surgery and the same as everyone else. So she starts comparing her mother's ladies who lunch friends with the women who serve them, and goes, well, you know what, these other women who I'm told are scum are far more attractive than my mother. And I think if you've got more than half a brain, you can work out where that's going in the end. But because I just said it's a romance, it's just that she noticed the servants. I think you can work that out. So, and there's this idea, if you start, as soon as you question one thing in a society, all the walls come tumbling down. As soon as you start to question something, it leads to another question, leads to another question, leads to another question. So in the end, her life falls apart, partly through her doing, partly through the system just being the system. And many of us have run into the system. It's in capital letters, the system, and we kind of know what it does. And
was it about also exploring? I wondered this while reading, sort of how Christine becomes aware, I guess. Is it about also the reader, you're questioning and challenging the reader to become aware of their surroundings?
Of course. So there's a common thing that's talking about in if anyone's been through mental health treatment using from a psychiatrist that uses the techniques in psychology that came from Buddhism, which is cognitive behavior therapy, came into psychology from Buddhism. Anyone who's ever done that, they realize that the first thing you learn is to notice your surroundings and question your thoughts. And that's the first thing you learn. That's the kind of the step, one of the steps toward mental health is to look at what you're seeing and see it properly, and think about what you're thinking and think about it properly. And once you really start looking, you can't look away. And that's, well, you can, but it becomes a conscious, active moment. So for example, just talking about the colonisation of Australia, which I talk about all the time, when people realise that the colonisation was violent, they can't look away. And the only way they can look away is by actively pushing it away, pushing the thoughts away. So Christine begins to see the world for what it is, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I'm actually reminded of a moment in one of these seasons of Black Comedy, where there's Nakia Louie's being Nakia Louie, doing one of her characters, and there's a white guy he says, you taught me all about colonisation, about what the world really is and how everyone's treated. Since you know you've learned the world, I said, yeah, but I can't unlearn it. I wish I could go back. And that's kind of what life's like. You take a step towards maturity and you can't go back.
And Christine very much is also thinking that she wants to go back in a way once she starts to realise maybe what her true path is.
Well, I think more she wants to go back in a physical sense, or knowing that she can't go back mentally. And of course, if you're in a world that requires you to think a certain way, if you can't think that way, you're not welcome there anymore. So she would want to go back to her privilege without giving up what she's learned, which is it can't be done. And that's kind of I think that's that and thanks again, Rhianna, you've broken my brain. That's kind of I suppose possibly a subconscious lesson in this, that once you've if you're a privileged person, once you learn the cost of your privilege, you can't go back to your privilege because you are no longer the same person. And that's kind of what, like, in a way, that's kind of the maturity that this country needs to go through, learning that our privilege, well, the privilege of white people, and that privilege as a nation, because Australia's like what, 7th wealthiest country per capita on earth. Our privilege as a country, particularly the privilege of the colonisers, once you realise what that cost, you can't unlearn it.
This is the point where I have to remember we can't talk about the second half of the book whatsoever.
I've done it again.
It's massive spoilers. And I was trying to work out how I could talk about the second half of the book without giving it away, because I want you to go on that journey. And I very much enjoyed going on the journey. But again, in Enclave book, there are 2 parts, and they're bit where you break my brain when I'm reading your novel. But in that second part, I guess there is a mention of Melbourne. I don't think I'm giving too much away. And I wonder about why you felt that Melbourne was the future city that you wanted to put in this book.
Well, there's 2 reasons why it's Melbourne. One reason is I've lived most of the last 25 years in Melbourne, maybe longer, I'm not sure now. I moved to Melbourne in 95. I'll come and gone, but always end up back in Melbourne since 1995. So that's a very long time. I don't know whether that's 27 years or something. And so Melbourne's a city I know. But also, when we think about the sort of politics that is making the world worse, and I won't say that the people trying to make the world worse, which is what, for example, Bob Marley called the people who do the world bad things for the world. He said that the people trying to make the world worse. I don't think they are. They're trying to make the world what they think is better. But the people who are making the world worse have been consistently voted out by Melbourne and consistently voted for by, unfortunately, Brisbane. Until the last election. I was going to say that. The most recent election, Brisbane did a good thing, and well done, Brisbane. But unfortunately, country Queensland is still full of dickheads. And I love country Queensland. I love it. No, I love it. But there's a hell of a lot of Nationals voters in country Queensland. There's a hell of a lot of Nationals voters in far east Victoria too. But so there's I can't remember where I was going.
It was about Melbourne.
Melbourne. So I believe that that Melbourne, if there's a chance to create a city where a caring society creates a new world, that place is probably, in Australia at least, that place is Melbourne. Possibly, maybe Hobart. Maybe now Brisbane's growing up a bit. Definitely not Sydney. I hate to say it, definitely not Sydney. I see shaking heads in the back, definitely not Sydney. And not Perth where I grew up. There's this change that has to come about, which is when people need to start caring more about each other than about themselves. And they need to care more about the future generations than about the current generation, which is where as a country we've failed. And I think if anywhere in Australia, although Melbourne has its faults, and I'm aware that the kind of the anti-vaxxer fascism movement in Australia was loudest in Melbourne. I'm aware of all these things, but Melbourne has kind of this hopefulness, this way of looking at the world where, when you think about, there's a reason the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre is based in Melbourne. There's a reason why Melbourne's more welcoming of refugees than every other city in Australia. It's because people in Melbourne are welcoming of difference. There's this, I don't know if anyone here has been to Melbourne, but there's this thing in Melbourne. In Sydney, for example, you go to a Lebanese neighbourhood, then a Turkish neighbourhood, the next to that's a Pakistani neighbourhood, the next to that's an Italian neighbourhood. In Melbourne, it was like that 30 years ago. But most of the time in Melbourne, there might be maybe two Pakistani shops next to each other, and the next to will be a Vietnamese restaurant. This Melbourne is this kind of big, the dream of multiculturalism we have in Australia is actually happening in Melbourne spontaneously. Melbourne doesn't have ghettoized neighbourhoods like other cities do for different groups. And the other one is, Sydney, everyone thinks of Sydney as having this big queer community, but statistically Melbourne has more queer people than Sydney. Because in Melbourne, queer people are just your next door neighbour, not the people in Oxford Street. And that's the difference. And that means Melbourne, to my mind, is the place where if there is a chance to build a better world, where there's no wankers and where everyone can have a happy, productive, sustainable life, in Australia at least, that place is Melbourne.
So it wasn't hard then to envisage a future Melbourne for you?
No, not at all. And I've been everywhere, and I've actually been homeless on the streets in both Sydney and Melbourne. And if I had to be homeless on the street somewhere, it'd probably be Melbourne, although it's freezing cold. But it's in Sydney it's scary, in Melbourne it's a little bit less scary.
I was going to ask about, because I got this feeling, and I had wondered, because of how future Melbourne is depicted in Enclave, I had wondered if Melbourne for you is your safe haven.
I think Melbourne is my safe haven. My ancestral country is in South WA. But every time I think I've gone back there, I remember it's a mining town. And I remember that Perth is full of cashed up bogans who are fly mining workers. And the thing that stops me leaving Melbourne is thinking of the people I have met in other places compared to Melbourne. And of course, before you get your backs up, there's good people in every city. The good people in Brisbane are in this room. But there's a lot of the Melbourne could never have produced Pauline Hanson. Let's put it that way. In that Melbourne had people like Pauline Hanson, who wouldn't have put him in Parliament.
We're getting close to where I'll open up if you do have any questions, and that goes for anyone online as well. So have your questions ready for Claire. By the end of this book, Christine is a completely different person. And I guess, you know, what has, like, where does she come to by the end of this book in terms of, I guess, the demons that she's faced along the way and the journey that she's been on?
Well, I think in a way it's a classic coming of age, in that she has to mature for the story. She needs to that's the classic story always has the protagonist maturing in some way. But in a way, what she does is she matures from somebody who almost fits in a shitty social media fueled dystopia for total wankers to someone who almost fits in a more mature society outside that space. So it's kind of like she matures from the sort of person who would troll someone on Twitter, the sort of person who would block the trolls on Twitter, which is they're very different sort of people. And that maturity, some people kind of a form of maturing doesn't change them that much because they come from a relatively mature culture, and when they mature a bit. But if someone comes from a very insular, very closed in society, and they mature and they become aware of other people, and that other people have a life and importance outside of themselves, when they expand their in-group to include more people, that form of maturing is like profoundly changing. And that's kind of what Christine went through. She goes from being very insular to being very grown up in an expansive and loving way. Because I like to think that it matches in a way the experience many of us go through when we go from being dickhead teenagers to environmental activists or whatever we do. Many of us mature like that, and I'm kind of interested in why someone would mature like that. That's what Christine is.
Is that why you like to write about young people? A lot of your, books, all the books I've read, all of yours, but you always focus on a young person.
I haven't really thought about it, to be truly honest. I certainly, in the stories I wanted to tell, young people are better characters, I think. And I think it's because young people have different challenges, I suppose. People have accused me of being a YA author. And if they want to accuse me of that, that's fine, I don't care. But in a way, I think stories involving younger characters are more popular anyway. But even you use the classic example of the Lord of the Rings. They put Frodo in the movie as in his early 20s. In the novel, he's in his late 30s. But late 30s for hobbits is about our early 20s for humans. It's very complicated. But we are all more interested in characters who can grow more, and kind of our late teens, early 20s when we're given that opportunity to grow. And it's really hard to, I think it's interesting for some readers to grow along with the characters. And therefore, if you have a younger character who can grow, people can watch them grow and grow along with them. even if that growth is in a few months of someone's life, but they're at an age where they can change profoundly. Whereas we all think of people older having rusted on sort of attitudes, and it's harder to come up with a believable character who changes. Might be fun to try it, maybe I should.
There's a thought for the future. I guess I want to know what you hope readers take away from this book. I mean, there are many themes in here around racism, around greed, around homophobia, privilege. And so I'm wondering, what is your hope of someone who picks up this book, reads it all the way through to the end, and what do you hope they walk away with?
Well, I hope that people learn that people are different, but that's a good thing. Yeah, we have as a society tends to believe that people are different and that maybe difference is a weakness. But really that adage will say diversity is strength, that's real. A society with more diversity is much more more stable. A society where everyone, well, maybe not stable, fertile is a better word. The edges between concepts are the interesting places, and that includes the edges between people. What is the difference between me and you is what's interesting, not what's the same about it. So therefore, if you remove everyone who's not like you, you've missed out on this opportunity to explore that edge between you and someone very different to yourself. And that's what I want people to learn, that space between us when we're different is much more interesting.
I might open it up to questions from the audience. If you have a question, put your hand up.
Are there any other major characters besides Christine?
Well, I've done an unusual thing because my first novel had 5 points of view. My second novel, The Old Lie, had I think 7 points of view. Enclave has 1. But there are other major characters. There's Christine's friend Jack, who's missing, therefore a character but in absentia for most of the novel. And there's of course Sienna, who is one of the servants of Christine's house, who I think I've hinted what that character's importance in the story is. And there's of course her Christine's mother and father. Father's a bit of a dick and mother's a bit of an alcoholic and a dick. Oh, and Christine's brother, who's also a dick.
Any other questions?
I wanted to ask about plotting, Claire, because your books, have that first half and that second half. And I wonder how much of that you know about before you go into it, or does it just do that when you get to the middle?
Yeah, well, that second version you did, that's pretty much it. I generally know what the start's going to be and what the middle's going to be. I have a vague idea what the end's going to be. I never write it down. I never plan it. I just go, I need this to happen in the middle. I need this to start happen at the beginning, and I need this to happen in the middle, and the rest of it, it happens. And I've never sat down and planned a novel. I just have an idea in my head of what they're going to be, and they kind of happen. I often joke that it feels sometimes like my books like themselves, but if I say that, I won't lose royalties. I definitely me, but it feels like they do themselves.
Are there any questions online?
None have come through just yet. Off the back of that question, so it sounds like you're a bit of a pantser rather than a plotter.
Totally.
So when it comes to actually your practice of writing, do you sit down and word vomit, or do you kind of chip away?
I do both. I sit down and word vomit, like I really word vomit. But then it's my opinion. I always say that if you think about it, there's a metaphor we always use, which is people saying a block of stone contains the statue already, and they chip away the bits that aren't the stone, aren't the statue from the stone. What I say is, the way I write is I do that. But the first draft is piling up, putting this block of stone in place, creating a block of stone from nothing, and then the edits are actually going through meticulously, removing all the bits that are shit. Which is, I mean, there's many things quoted, attributed to Hemingway about writing. People come up with all these things that Hemingway said. The only one that's ever been confirmed is Hemingway really did say the first draft of anything is shit.
What was it like working with, having an editor that had been with you since the start to then changing midway for this book?
Well, Robert Watkins signed my very first book, Terra Nullius, and then he edited as the acquisition editor, edited my second novel, Yodlai, and acquired Enclave, and we got through the entire process of editing, and then he left the company and got another job, and then got to do a book for that company too, but that's another story. It was hard. It was really hard because it felt like I'd been through the process twice. And the reason I felt like I'd been through the process twice because I went through the process twice. And it was very challenging, but I think in the end it might have ended up with a better book, because the idea of editing with a publisher is it knocks all the rough edges off your narrative. And I knocked the rough edges of this novel for a long time because it went through all the way through, and then a new editor took it and started again. So, and it was nearly at the stage of publishing when they started again. And I don't regret that. I got cranky at the time. I swore a lot at the time. I swore, I cried, but I think in the end it worked out. I know, maybe it didn't work out. Maybe if one of the Marines going to read it and go, no, it didn't work out. But no, it's important, I think, to know that if anyone in this room aspires to be a writer or is already a famous writer, like there is one in the room before I mentioned, I think it's important to realise that the edit is actually the work, not the draft. The draft you can do in a couple of weeks, but the edit will take years, and that is a fact. You have to face that. So, in a way, I both loved and hated having to go through it twice.
But did you feel that by the end of it that was a good process maybe to go through?
Difficult question, because I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know whether that process made it a better book than it would have been without the quantity of editing it did, which is the most edited book I've ever done. I don't know. But I also don't know. I don't know whether it was a better book before the second round of editing, or the third or fourth or fifth or sixth or seventh. Anyone who doesn't know how writing works, you write a book, you edit with a couple of rounds with your acquisition editor, and then you go through several rounds what's called structure edits, sometimes with another editor, and then you do copy edits and then proofreads. And by the end of that process, you actually hate the novel you're working on. You really you hate it, you want to burn it, but someone paid you for it, so you have to finish it. But I don't know whether having gone through that process so much made a better book or not, because after a while, I don't know if this is true of anyone else, but I have a very hard time judging the quality of my own work. My understanding of whether or not a novel is good comes from the reaction of others entirely, not from myself. So I don't know whether it was worth it or not. What I do know is I wasn't really given a choice, so I had to do it that way. But and it was horrible to lose an editor kind of at that stage. It was horrible, and I cried when Robert left Hachette. I cried, and I think because people don't know this, but the relationship between a writer and the kind of whoever tends to be their connection at the publishing company depends on the writer, but it can be close to the family or as close as family. So it's really hard. But I'm working with Robert again because my non-fiction book was out with his new publishing company. But it's yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. That was a lot of words to say. I don't fucking know.
Any other questions in the room or online?
We've had one come through online
fantastic.
from Hanadi. They want to know, where do your speculative sci-fi inspiration or ideas come from?
They come from life, I suppose. It's really weird. People who people think. I think it was Neil Gaiman who said when someone asks where the inspiration comes from, I go to the inspiration shop. People think there's some magical place where inspiration comes from, and it doesn't. Inspiration for speculative fiction such as sci-fi or any writing comes from your life, from news, from walking down the street, from tripping over a log, from talking to your friends. It can come from anywhere. And it's like sometimes it can be like a bolt out of the blue. You don't know what's going to do it. You'll be, for example, you'll be walking along and you'll hear a news story on the news, and that'll be the trigger. You go, that's the story. Or sometimes you'll hear a song and go, one line in the song a story will unfold an entire story. Well, that's how it is for me anyway. And other times you'll spend months racking your brain for a new idea, looking for this, like for the new story that you've been waiting for. And you'll go, wow, I've racked my brain, I've worked it out. And you start working on that idea, you go, no, that's shit. And then 5 minutes later, you'll trip over a rock, hit your face on a sign, and go, hey, there's the idea. So it's just, you don't know. You can never know where your idea is going to come from. It's just thing.
Well, what are some of those influences when you were younger then?
Well, influences. 19th century science fiction is really a strong influence on my work. War of the Worlds, 1984, Frankenstein, which I think might be 18th century. But they kind of, the strong influence for me is the science fiction that was written before there was such thing as science fiction. Is a really good influence, I think. They weren't afraid to tackle big stories and rewrite an entire world to make the story work, which is kind of what I try and do. Another strong influence is rock music. People often ask me about this and ask me what books inspire my books, and I answer generally it's having music on. I don't read when I'm writing, but I do listen to music a lot when I'm writing. And I'm not read the same day as writing. If I'm working on a novel, I generally can't read anyone else's novels. It drives me wobbly in the head to try and read someone else's work on doing my own. But I'll listen to music constantly. I listen to Aboriginal reggae.
What was the playlist for Enclave then?
The playlist for Enclave. I did have a playlist. Actually, I put together playlists sometimes. There are lots of things in it, actually. There was, to be honest, a hell of a lot of Nick Cave. A lot of Nick Cave. Then again, there's also a lot of Nick Cave in the playlist for Terra Nullius as well. I think there's a pattern. But no, it's every novel has had one band in particular. If you ever want to look up one of the bands that's always in my head, but it's a band called Chintu Desert Band from Walkery country, who are an Aboriginal desert reggae band, and that's always a strong inspiration.
Oh, we've got a question.
We've got another one that's come through from Stephen. He says, I love the way your brain works, Claire, and can't wait to read this new work. Love also your political reading of Australian city space and have a similar affection for Melbourne. Just for fun, where do you place Darwin and Canberra in your roundup of Australia?
Years ago, I had a box in my house. Can't remember where it came from, but it was from a company called the Canberra Mushroom Company. It was actually a box I used to deliver mushrooms for sale in supermarkets. I don't know where it came from. I couldn't tell you, but on it it was it was Canberra, it said Canberra Mushrooms Company, and their slogan was mushrooms are the only thing kept in the dark. And that kind of sums up Canberra. Really, Canberra is it's a funny weird place, isn't it? It's got this weird culture of everyone who's there is either in government or works for government, or sells food to people working in government. It's really weird. And if you've never been to Canberra, you must go at least once to get lost going around a roundabout. Because Canberra's all roundabouts. So if anyone doesn't know, it is a roundabout going to a roundabout, and you take another roundabout, then another roundabout attached to it. Weird place. And yeah, Canberra's there is soul in Canberra. There's culture and soul and stuff going on, but for the most part, Canberra's like it's empty. There's people there, but it feels empty. Well, you go there and you don't feel like there's anything happening there. Darwin, on the other hand, sometimes feels like there's too much happening, Darwin. Darwin's weird. I love Darwin a bit. So I'm going there in a few weeks' time. But it's got this kind of really, really weird, you feel like when you're walking down the street in Darwin, you feel like absolutely anything could happen all of a sudden and you wouldn't be shocked. You feel like you could walk down the street and a drag queen would come running out of a bar and you wouldn't be shocked. You wouldn't be shocked to see some guy with a shotgun with a cowboy hat. You just don't know what you're going to see in Darwin. It's a lovely place. But you can't pin down the politics. Really weird, because politically in the Northern Territory, weirdly, to talk about one of the people with whom I've had various political feuds, just ended up with Jipper. She's really popular in Alice Springs. She was the deputy mayor. She got in Parliament based on the Alice Springs vote. She's Aboriginal, she's Warlpiri, but in every election, the lowest scoring polling booths in the Northern Territory for voting for her are in her own community. Her own family vote her lower than the white people of Alice Springs. That kind of says a lot about the politics of the Northern Territory. There's a kind of racist edge where they choose which Aboriginal people get to speak. And that's the politics of the Northern Territory. And yet you go to Alice Springs, and I was there at Bushbands Bash, which if you ever get a chance to go to Bushbands Bash, just go. And I think it was my first or second time at Alice Springs. And I heard over the PA, they were talking about the bands that are coming on, and the PA stopped, the announcer stopped and turned off all the music and said, "Oh, Star Lady has entered the building." And Star Lady is a drag queen hairdresser and was announced in Alice Springs. Alice Springs has got this weird kind of queer as hell vibe and this weird redneck vibe at the same time. So I love the Northern Territory because it is so weird.
I think I did see one hand up the back, and I think you'll be our last question.
I was just going to ask about your poetry, Claire. Are you still writing poetry, or is that in the back burner now? And is it a different mindset you have?
Very good question. Thank you for that. Very hard question. I still do poetry. I was at a writer's festival and I was watching an event with the activist and independent journalist Laurie Penny, who lives in Melbourne now, but they're originally from the UK. And they said they'd written a poem while sitting at the panel, and that was, "I'm going to read a poem." "No, I'm not, because not everyone should write poetry." And they said, "No, actually, that's not true. Everyone should write poetry. It's like push-ups for your mind, but not everyone should read their poetry out." And that stuck with me. I still write poetry. I love writing. I read poetry. I think poetry is like a music. Writing poetry is like a musician doing their scales, or like a boxer punching a punching bag, or a runner jogging. It makes every writer who writes it better at the other writing. No matter what they do, it just makes you better at doing it. So I still write poetry. I find it very difficult to get my poetry published. And I think that's just because the market of people who buy poetry or the place you can get poetry published is very small. Someone I can't remember who it was, but a poet once joked to me that the problem with poetry is that the market for poetry is poets. And that is a sad thing, and I think we all should read more poetry as well. I think if we read more poetry, it'll make us all better people. And if we listen to slam poetry, make us much better people. We all should do more, go to slam poetry nights. But I find poetry quite challenging. I have had some success. I have won an entire one poetry award, which is I've actually won as many visual art awards as poetry awards, but I still enjoy writing it, and I love reading it, and I would rather read poetry than pretty much anything else.
Well, on that note, Claire, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you. And if anyone knows this, Rhianna also launched Terra Nullius, so it's like in 3 books, 2 launches. And when they said anyone in mind to launch Brisbane, I said it has to be Rhianna. It has to be.
Well, I enjoyed being forced to read your book. So, Jane.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you, Rhianna. We feel so lucky at Atwood to have launched this wonderful book into the world. We've got copies at the counter as well as some of Claire's backlist as well. And we'll have Claire signing copies so you can chat to her more and get your copy signed. Thank you so much, everyone.
And also.